Welcome back to DFC Books.
And welcome to a deep dive that I think it's fair to say might just rattle your theological foundations.
That is a very fair way to put it.
Today, we are immersing ourselves in one of the most provocative retellings of what is probably the foundational Western myth, Jose Saramago's The Gospel According to Jesus Christ.
That's absolutely right. And if you're coming to this looking for, reverence and tradition, this is not the book for you.
Not at all.
Saramago, who is a Nobel laureate, is known for his very distinct style, these long, unpunctuated sentences. And he takes the story of Jesus and just strips away all the divine certainty.
He really does. What you're left with is, it feels like a political tragedy. It's all fueled by human anxiety, this inescapable guilt, and these strategic negotiations between cosmic forces.
It's masterful, deeply skeptical, and honestly, it's often a brutal piece of literature.
So our mission today is to try and distill this massive, unique vision for you. We're going to chart a course through the narrative, focusing on the major characters, Joseph, Mary, and of course, Jesus.
And we're going to track their psychological evolution, really, through the key events that shaped their destiny in this radical interpretation.
Exactly. We're exploring how Saramago turns these, revered biblical figures into profoundly human, deeply flawed individuals who are just trapped by fate.
And Saramago, he sets the stage with such immediate intentional tension right from the opening epigraphs. It's a direct contradiction about what truth even is.
Precisely. On one hand, you have the very cautious certainty of Luke, who's promising the reader that he has, and I'm quoting here, perfect understanding of all things from the very first, so that thou mightest know the certainty of those things.
Right. It's the official story, the desire for an orderly historical truth.
But then, immediately after that promise of certainty, we get this curt, almost defiant declaration from Pontius Pilate.
Quod scripsi.
What I have written, I've written. It's so final. It's an immutable, subjective statement of human accountability.
It feels like it immediately signals that we're leaving the comforting realm of divine providence.
Yes, and entering a world where human choices and the records of those choices are the only things that truly matter. It suggests that even this, the greatest story ever told, is just something that someone, flawed and subjective, chose to write down.
And that frame, where human writing just overrides divine certainty, that is absolutely crucial for understanding the character who carries the initial and I think the heaviest burden in the story, Joseph.
Joseph is grounded right away in the mundane, which is what makes his later moral failure so compelling. Saramago introduces him as a religious man, for sure, but also intensely practical.
What do you mean by practical?
Well, he's the kind of man who praises God, but for having, quote, endowed mankind with the essential orifices and vessels to live. He's worried about survival, about the body, even as his mind wanders into these deep, almost ridiculous theological questions.
Right. I love that moment of dark humor because he applies this really serious analytical rigor to everyday life. Like he actually wonders about the theological status of the soul during sleep.
Yeah. If we thank God for restoring our soul when we wake up, he thinks, does that mean his sleeping wife is just a body without a soul until morning?
He's trying to reconcile the practicalities of being alive with the mysteries of faith. And that effort just leaves him terrified by anything he can't explain.
And that's his core identity. He's a dutiful carpenter, but we see from the get-go how easily that could be shaken by events he can't categorize or control.
And he's also living under this constant social observation, which is symbolized by his neighbors, Ananias and Shua. They represent that ever-present social pressure of a small village.
Ananias is the classic busybody, isn't he? Described as meddlesome, yet concerned. He warns Joseph about the census with this smug expression, like he enjoys knowing something Joseph doesn't.
And his wife, Shua, she's that other side of the community, outwardly sympathetic, but maybe inwardly judgmental, worrying aloud about Mary. Poor child, and so delicate. What is to become of you? About to give birth any day now.
This whole backdrop is so vital. It shows us that Joseph is a man who is used to fitting in, to being judged by his community's standards.
Which makes his later decision, the one that leads to the Bethlehem massacre, so much more horrifying. It's not just a theological failure, it's a complete break from social solidarity, and it's driven by this overwhelming fear of exposure.
And that exposure, that trouble, it begins with Mary. Saramago portrays her as the traditional submissive wife. She's consistently described as being physically delicate.
Her initial experience of the divine is mystical, sure, but it's also incredibly passive.
Right. She receives the message from the beggar, who might be an angel, in a submissive voice. and we're told she instinctively covers her face with her arm when Joseph enters. A gesture of traditional deference. She's the receiver here, not the actor.
And the Annunciation itself, it's completely stripped of any traditional glory. It's just this confounding scene with a beggar and this bizarre central artifact.
This handful of luminous earth placed in a bowl.
Yeah, and it comes with this totally vague prophecy. Nothing begins without coming to an end. Nothing ends without having a beginning.
It's the opposite of a clear divine mandate. It creates terror, not awe. The symbolic weight of this glowing earth and the words earth to earth, it immediately links the divine announcement to death, to finality.
And when this event is filtered through human fear, the results are immediate panic.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because the village elders, Zacchaeus, Dothan, and Abiathar, they turn this moment into a kind of political council of fear.
They decide that this sign, this piece of glowing soil, forebodes evil, and it has to be buried. It has to be covered up.
That decision is just pure Saramago cynicism. They don't try to understand the divine sign. Their immediate reaction is to conceal it, to try and diminish the power of evil by hiding it from sight.
So the moment the divine touches the human world,
The human world responds with fear, denial, and a cover-up. And this act of concealment, driven by their collective anxiety, is a perfect parallel to Joseph's later catastrophic decision.
and of course, their efforts to hide this sign are immediately made irrelevant by the arrival of cold, hard Roman law.
Which brings us to the census and birth, mandated by Caesar Augustus and Consul Publius Sulpicius Quirinius.
The census forces this incredibly painful, mandatory journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and Saramago really emphasizes the physical suffering. Mary's in severe pain riding this donkey.
An animal that, ironically, is described as having infinite patience and stamina to match the endless journey. She's carrying what Joseph, in his own anxiety, calls a giant.
Joseph's anxiety is so high, he's literally trying to negotiate with Roman bureaucracy through prayer. He has this argument with Simeon where he says that if the child isn't born by the last day of the census,
It'll be a sign from God that he does not wish the Romans to know of the child's existence.
it's such a desperate, frantic attempt to create some kind of theological shield against the political reality of Roman occupation. He's looking for any sign, any loophole to protect his family, even before he knows what the real danger is.
The stage is completely set for a catastrophic clash between his deep piety and his instinct for self-preservation.
And the final scene of the birth is so profoundly anti-romantic. They're refused shelter, they end up in a cold cave, an animal shelter.
And even nature itself seems to recognize the gravity, the potential tragedy of this birth. The shepherds report back to Joseph that the earth seems to be screaming.
Saramago is telling us that the moment this child arrives, the world is crying out in agony. It's not celebrating in joy. It's a birth that immediately foreshadows tragedy and suffering.
Which brings us to section 2, which is really the narrative pivot. This is the moment Saramago rewrites the historical fate of Jesus by exposing the secret at the heart of his family.
And it's all dominated by the trauma of the Bethlehem massacre.
The massacre is set up not by a glorious star or wise men, but by King Herod's crippling psychological torment. Herod is tormented by these prophetic dreams, specifically the warnings of the prophet Micah.
What's so fascinating here is that the torment comes from the interruption of the prophecy. The prophet withdraws just before revealing more, and it leaves Herod in agonizing suspense, awaiting some new threat, but what threat and how and when?
This lack of full information is exactly what drives his cruel decision. He can't bear the uncertainty, the foreboding, so he decides to act preemptively.
Ordering the death of all infants in Bethlehem under the age of 3.
And the one man who discovers this horrible plan is Joseph. He just happens to be working on the temple site in Jerusalem, close enough to overhear the Roman soldiers talking.
He overhears them discussing the details, the scope of the order, and that chilling estimate from the census.
That they would kill around 25 infants. Saramago gives
know.
us that number, a cold, bureaucratic detail, just to underscore the scale of the human tragedy that's about to unfold.
And this is the critical defining moment for Joseph. He runs back, but his immediate priority is so narrow, so self-serving.
Instead of raising the alarm, instead of sacrificing his family's safety for the good of the community, he hides Mary and Jesus in the cave.
His reasoning is that the soldiers were ordered to carry out a house-to-house search. So if they're outside the village, hidden in the cave, they might be missed.
It's an act that saves his son, but it damns all the others by denying them any chance to flee or defend themselves. It is a profound, unforgivable moral stain, a choice driven purely by overwhelming self-preservation.
The immediate consequence is just the sound of overwhelming, unmitigated human suffering. The women of Bethlehem screams and wailing just echo from hill to hill.
And Saramago insists on this detail. These are not weeping angels lamenting human misfortune. These are the voices of men and women maddened by grief beneath an empty sky.
That phrase, beneath an empty sky, is just devastating. It completely removes any sense of divine compassion or involvement.
You're left with only human responsibility and the vacuum of God's silence. And Joseph is left to internalize this crime, which results in an enduring remorse that completely consumes his existence.
His guilt manifests as a persistent psychological disorder. He starts having these nightmarish confusions, these dreams where he's confessing to an expedition leader that he is on his way to Bethlehem to kill my son.
The guilt has just blurred the lines of who is the perpetrator and who is the victim in his own mind.
The narrator confirms that this psychological torment is his constant state of remorse, just hovering on the threshold between sleep and waking. He understands subconsciously that by saving his son, he killed the sons of others.
And life goes on, but the weight of that moral compromise is immense. Mary becomes pregnant again, but this time it's completely mundane.
I'm with child, she says. There's no angel disguised as a beggar. The birth of their second child is simply the continuation of ordinary life, thrown into this sharp, contrasting relief against the supposed divine nature of the first.
You know what really stands out to me here, though, is the narrator's incredible observation about God himself feeling remorse.
Oh, right. That God never sleeps because
he made a mistake which no man would be forgiven. The massacre. This implies that Joseph's guilt is just a mortal echo of a divine, colossal error. But it's an error where Joseph had to carry the practical burden of the moral failure.
So the narrative gives Joseph one moment of attempted atonement, which leads him to his final, cruel destiny. We move to Joseph's crucifixion.
He travels to Sepphoris to rescue his wounded neighbor Ananias, the same meddlesome neighbor from before, who had joined the rebel army of Judas the Galilean.
This is Joseph trying to perform a selfless act, an act of community redemption, maybe a last-ditch attempt to override his initial selfish choice.
And the irony is just brutal. Joseph, who considers himself a carpenter and a man of peace, is mistaken for a rebel by the Romans.
Even the rebels themselves disavow him. They're shouting that he's just a carpenter, but the Roman officer is completely indifferent. He just declares, the only place you're going is to your death.
And Saramago uses this scene to remind us of the terrifying industrial scale of Roman violence. He mentions 2,000 crucified rebels, describing the organized punishment, with donkeys and mules laden with posts and crossbars, which can be assembled on the spot.
Death is just a logistics problem for Rome, and Joseph is just a logistical casualty.
The final act of this tragedy is the inheritance. Jesus, who's now a youth, follows Mary to Sepphoris and finds his father's broken body, and he retrieves Joseph's worn and covered with dust sandals, tucking them under his belt.
It's such a powerful, dark symbol, Joseph's firstborn claiming his inheritance.
But the inheritance isn't property or a trade. It's the inheritance of guilt of a moral debt, and the realization that his own life is founded on a crime. Those sandals represent the very footsteps that led Joseph to his moral compromise and his ultimate death.
So Joseph's choice and death, they create this psychological crucible for the young Jesus. And Saramago introduces Jesus not as some divine child, but as an ordinary boy who slobbers, gets dirty, and cries.
His defining characteristic isn't miracles, it's intellectual skepticism. And it's fueled by this inherited moral responsibility.
That skepticism starts really early as he's studying the Torah. The core question that starts to consume him is intensely philosophical and moral.
Why did God save Isaac from Abraham's knife, providing a ram for the sacrifice, yet do absolutely nothing to protect the innocent children of Bethlehem?
It's a foundational crisis of faith for him. He sees the parallel. Abraham's choice was tested and then redeemed by God's intervention. Joseph's choice was tested and it ended in a massacre.
And the lack of mercy shown to those infants who he knows were as innocent as Abraham's son is the gap in theology he just can't reconcile. He realizes that the great promises of the Old Testament seem completely arbitrary when they're applied to real human life.
If God is just, how could he allow all this collateral damage just to save one chosen child?
This juxtaposition between divine favor and mass suffering becomes the foundation of Jesus' new skeptical moral code.
And that intellectual drive, it leads to the inevitable, crucial confrontation with Mary. The truth has to come out.
Jesus finally forces Mary to reveal the truth about the Bethlehem slaughter. He demands to know exactly how Herod's soldiers missed him.
And Mary, after all these years of silence and complicity, finally tells him that Joseph overheard the plot and chose to hide them in the cave while the soldiers were searching the houses.
The conclusion Jesus draws is stark and totally unforgiving.
Father murdered the children of Bethlehem. He blames Joseph for not sounding the alarm, arguing that he made no attempt to save them. This realization that his own existence is a moral debt is just intolerable.
And the emotional depth here is immense. Mary, by hiding the truth for so long, has been an accessory to the cover-up. She's betrayed his search for truth.
Jesus can't live with the knowledge that his life is predicated on murder. He leaves home at 13, unable to sleep because of visions of the massacre, sometimes wishing he were dead.
And Mary covers for him. She maintains the lie of normalcy, telling the neighbors he's going to Jerusalem for work. The narrator calls this a bare-faced lie, underscoring how the family continues to rely on deception to manage their tragedy.
So his journey is really an intellectual crisis that's disguised as a pilgrimage. He claims he's going to consult the teachers of the temple about a point of holy law that greatly concerned his family.
In the temple, he starts debating the scholars, challenging the established definitions of guilt. He questions that Old Testament idea that children won't die for the sins of their parents, and he juxtaposes it with the doctrine that all men inherit the guilt of Adam and Eve.
He's pointing out the contradiction.
He's pushing it even further. He suggests that the father's guilt, even after punishment, Joseph was crucified, is still passed on to the children. He arrives at this radical philosophical position that just shakes the notion of divine separation.
Which is that each man is a part of God.
And if each man is a part of God, then God is fully implicated in Joseph's decision, in the Bethlehem slaughter, in the entire bloody history of mankind. It shifts the burden of guilt from the individual man right back onto the divine entity.
Amidst all this high-stakes theological debate, Saramago gives us this small, grounding detail that emphasizes Jesus' humanity and his poverty.
He gets a complimentary bowl of milk from a Pharisee, an object he cherishes.
It's a wonderful, poignant moment of connection. The narrator notes that he wraps it so carefully, knowing these earthenware bowls are fragile and easily broken. He's a young, hungry man who treasures a simple, fragile gift.
A fragility that perfectly mirrors his own vulnerable human status and the fragility of the peace he's searching for.
From Jerusalem, his quest for understanding takes him back to the source of his trauma, Bethlehem. He visits the cave where he was born, and he speaks to Salome, an old slave who was there at his birth.
And Salome just confirms the prevailing fatalism of the world. She believed the will of kings is beyond understanding, and everything that happens, even the slaughter, can happen only by the will of God.
Which only deepens Jesus' sense of divine indifference and absolute power.
It's in that cave, the very site of his birth and his father's betrayal, that Jesus falls asleep and meets Pastor. And this is where the narrative takes its darkest, most provocative turn. The introduction of the devil figure.
Pastor is mysterious. He claims to have known Jesus since birth. He won't even give a name, just suggests, "Call me Pastor, the shepherd."
But he speaks with this immediate philosophical irreverence toward God. His analysis of God is chilling.
He suggests that God avoids the nightmares of remorse that plagued Joseph and now Jesus.
And Pastor explicitly states that the divine guides the dagger in the hand of the assassin while he offers the throat that is about to be cut.
So this shepherd figure, the devil, isn't cloaked in fire and brimstone. He's a philosophical entity arguing for God's active complicity in human suffering.
Pastor introduces the idea that darkness and accountability are fundamentally entwined with the highest power. This conversation prepares Jesus for the horrifying reality that God isn't separate from evil, but is maybe its orchestrator.
And this exposure to Pastor leads Jesus into 4 years as his shepherd, a period that serves as this profound trial, testing his compassion against the literal demands of a cold, pragmatic God.
This trial culminates in a direct confrontation with the divine, the establishment of the covenant. God appears not in some dazzling form, but as a cloud or smoke, an ambiguous, distant figure, and commands Jesus to perform a sacrifice.
And the demand is specific. Jesus must sacrifice a sheep that he personally raised. It's a test of his willingness to accept necessary cruelty.
And Jesus refuses. He says, "I cannot lead to its death an animal that I myself raised." It shows his inherent compassion, his resistance to violence based on personal attachment.
But God is not seeking discussion or emotional consent. He just efficiently provides a new sheep and a cleaver, forcing the sacrifice.
It underscores the cold, mechanical nature of divine command. If Jesus won't choose the victim, God will provide a replacement and the means of execution.
The physical consequence for Jesus is so revealing. His feet get wounded by thorns during this trial, representing the human cost of struggling with divine will.
But God, who can conjure a cleaver out of thin air, does not heal him. The divine demands sacrifice and service, but offers no comfort or grace for the pain that results.
Past us, who's been watching this whole thing, delivers the verdict that casts Jesus out. You've learned nothing. Be gone with you.
Jesus has failed to accept the harsh terms of power, which require the detachment you need to sacrifice the innocent.
And this expulsion, this failure of the trial, leads him directly to Mary Magdalene. This encounter provides such a powerful contrast between the cold, violent demands of the divine and the immediate, unconditional grace of human love.
Jesus meets her in Magdala. He's penniless and wounded, just looking for work. And Saramago elevates her description with this elaborate, sensual, biblical poetry. Her hair is like a flock of goats descending the mountain slopes of Gilead. Her eyes are like the pools of Heshbon.
She becomes his immediate practical healer. She tends to his wounded, bleeding foot that's oozing this disgusting yellow pus. She heals his physical pain before anything else.
It represents the power of tangible human care over abstract divine command. And this sets the stage for the true healing, the night of love and nightmare.
Jesus and Mary Magdalene sleep together. He's washed and adored by her. And that night, the nightmare returns, the recurring vision of the Bethlehem slaughter that has driven him since he was a child.
And here's where the emotional vulnerability is so crucial. For the first time, Jesus breaks his silence. He shares the terrible truth with her.
Children in Bethlehem died because of my father. He killed them because he made no attempt to save them.
And Mary Magdalene is entirely accepting. Saramago frames their bond so beautifully. His body is pure, and hers is described as defiled by her profession, as the text describes her as a prostitute. But their shared world, the space they create through love and honesty, is pure.
She accepts his guilt as part of who he is.
But their bond is broken when the divine world calls again. Jesus joins the fishermen, Simon, Andrew, James, and John, and he's helping them with these miraculous catches.
This growing, undeniable power draws him back to the ultimate terrifying encounter on the Sea of Galilee.
This is the moment of the second divine meeting where the plan is revealed. God and pastor appear together in a thick mist on the lake. This isn't some mystical vision, it's a theological negotiation.
God confirms Jesus as his son and then reveals the ultimate goal. Jesus must be the martyr, the victim, because martyrdom is the best role of all for propagating any faith and stirring up fervor.
The goal is explicitly political, transitioning God from being God of the Jews to being God of those whom we will call Catholics.
Wait, so if the mission is explicitly stated as theological and political expansion, then Saramago is basically arguing that the purpose of Christ's sacrifice isn't redemption, it's marketing, it's brand expansion.
Exactly. And Jesus, realizing the monstrous, centuries-long cost of this divine strategy, demands to know the total suffering involved. He demands the truth about the future.
And God delivers the horrific details. He reveals the massacres, the persecutions. His future followers will be speared, gored, buried alive, sawed in two, shot with arrows, mutilated, tortured, and most chillingly,
The coming Inquisition.
when God lays out the total cost and mentions the Inquisition, that's Saramago directly implicating the divine in the worst of human cruelty, suggesting that centuries of mass torture carried out in Christ's name are just part of the business plan.
And Jesus is horrified to learn that his sacrifice will lead to endless suffering carried out by his followers, rather than redemption for them.
And the devil, pastor, is right there negotiating the terms. He confirms his role is necessary, and he articulates this chilling concept of codependence.
This is the core philosophical insight of the novel, Pastor says. Because the good I represent cannot exist without the evil you represent. If you were to end, so would I. Unless the devil is the devil, God cannot be God.
They're eternal symbiotic partners.
So, if the devil is necessary for God's existence, then Saramago is essentially arguing there is no true good, only a system of eternal political leverage and partnership.
Jesus reluctantly submits. He bargains only for the truth about the suffering that will follow. He is now the sacrificial lamb, destined for a predetermined political and historical role, trapped completely by the divine will.
So Jesus begins his ministry now, carrying the explicit knowledge of his fate, the colossal bloody cost of his sacrifice, and the realization that God and the devil are codependent co-workers.
And this knowledge fundamentally alters the nature of his ministry.
It manifests immediately in his complete rejection of his biological family. When his brothers, James and Joseph, try to bring him home to Nazareth, asserting their familial rights, Jesus publicly rejects them.
He draws a clear line, prioritizing his mission over kinship. Who are my mother and brothers? My mother and brothers are they who believe me when I speak. It's a necessary political move to establish his new identity at a deeply painful one for his family.
His powers are growing, but they're framed not as moments of pure glory, but as necessary tools for his political role. After a violent storm, he commands the sea and sky to be quiet, be calm, solidifying his disciples' belief.
But these acts are all infused with this melancholy. When he raises Lazarus, Jesus finds these acts of physical rebirth deeply sad.
He recognizes them only as a postponement of the inevitable. He knows all his miracles are just temporary fixes, delaying a fate that is already sealed for all mankind, including the man he just resurrected.
His confrontation with religious law and sin is also complicated by his relationship with Mary Magdalene. When they bring him the adulteress for stoning,
Jesus defends her by suggesting he can't throw a stone because he is living in sin with Mary Magdalene, who the text describes as a prostitute.
it's a powerful act of moral solidarity. He places himself beneath the moral law he's expected to uphold, because he recognizes that enforcing strict legal purity requires a level of hypocrisy he's no longer willing to maintain, given the true nature of the divine plan.
Then you have the surprising act of the demonic transfer in Capernaum. Jesus exorcises legion many demons from a man, and he permits the demons to enter a herd of 2,000 pigs,
Which immediately drown themselves in the lake.
It's fascinating because Jesus' miracle is immediately catastrophic for the local economy. The loss of 2,000 pigs is an immense economic disaster for the Gentile swineherds. It shows divine power operating with absolutely no regard for the mundane, human consequences of poverty and livelihood.
It just underscores Saramago's theme that God's actions are always politically and economically disruptive.
The narrative then shifts to the fate of John the Baptist, underlining the small human causes behind great divine tragedies. John is beheaded not for prophesying the Messiah, as you might expect for a prophet.
But for speaking out against Herod's adultery, his marriage to his niece and sister-in-law, Herodias.
It's a reminder that even foundational acts of martyrdom are often triggered by petty political squabbles and human lust, not some grand cosmic destiny. And Jesus uses this death to prepare his remaining disciples for their own calculated martyrdoms, fulfilling the divine plan.
He reveals the precise, horrific deaths of his core disciples. Peter will be crucified, Philip killed with a lance, Judas the Deus will have his skull crushed, and Simon will be sawed in half.
He assures John he will live a long life, while Judas Iscariot's fate is left chillingly ambiguous. Jesus is now acting like a strategic military commander, briefing his troops on the necessary sacrifices for the expansion of the faith.
He knows their deaths are mandatory for the successful implementation of God's political strategy.
So the inevitable descent begins with the temple riot. Jesus and his disciples violently overturn the tables of the money changers and the dove sellers, scattering coins, setting fire to tents.
They're not just protesting commerce, they're inciting rebellion. They're taunting the guards to feel God's might.
This violent act is the guaranteed trigger for his arrest. It's the final mandated step in the divine plan. Jesus is arrested outside Bethany and is led into Jerusalem between two soldiers, his hands tied like those of a common thief.
And that final scene of grief, it just highlights the spectrum of human reaction to fate. The men, the disciples are fuming, the women followers are sobbing and wailing. But Mary Magdalene, who understands the terrible bargain he struck on the lake, stands apart.
She is the sole figure who grieved in silence. She knows this ending wasn't an accident or misunderstanding, it was mandatory. She knows the true cost of the gospel according to Jesus Christ.
Stepping back from this extraordinary narrative, what you see is a complete reframing of the Christian story, and it's all rooted in this profound human guilt and strategic cosmic manipulation.
Absolutely. The central theme is the heavy burden of guilt, which originated with Joseph's self-serving choice during the Bethlehem massacre and was passed down to Jesus.
And that guilt transforms Jesus from a philosophical skeptic into a reluctant martyr. Not because he was divine in the traditional sense, but because he was the perfect victim needed for a calculated political and theological strategy.
He was the instrument designed by God and the devil, working in tandem to expand divine influence through martyrdom.
The revelation at the Sea of Galilee, that man is a mere toy in the hands of God and forever subject to his will, it just strips away the comforting idea of meaningful free will. Fate, in Saramago's view, is simply a necessary tool for God's larger and often incredibly bloody historical expansion plan.
And that takes us right back to the ultimate provocative thought Saramago leaves us with, the nature of good and evil themselves. When Jesus questions why God won't forgive the devil, God's response confirms their chilling codependence.
He says, I much prefer you as you are, because the good I represent cannot exist without the evil you represent. If you were to end, so would I. Unless the devil is the devil, God cannot be God.
This suggests that the foundational forces of the universe are not antagonists struggling for supremacy over humanity, but are actually codependent partners in human history, forever locked in this symbiotic relationship.
They need each other to define their roles and to execute their plan.
It's a sobering and profoundly moving piece of literature. It forces you, the listener, to consider what it means for faith and for moral responsibility when the ultimate forces of good and evil are codependent co-workers in human history. To believe in God, in this gospel, is also to accept the essential, unredeemable nature of the devil as God's necessary partner.
A stunning deep dive into a truly extraordinary literary vision. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Saramago's The Gospel According to Jesus Christ.
We look forward to having you for the next deep dive.